What if the decision that saved half the universe in Avengers Endgame was actually the decision that doomed the entire multiverse? In Endgame, the Avengers believed they had found the perfect way to fix the impossible. Thanos had erased half of all life, the Infinity Stones were gone, and there was no way to simply undo what had happened. So the Avengers did something no one had ever done before. They went backward through time, collected the stones from key moments in history, brought them back to the present, and used them to reverse the snap. It worked. Billions of people returned. The universe survived. And for a moment, it looked like the story was over. But there was one warning buried inside that victory that becomes much more disturbing when you look at everything that happened afterward. Tony Stark understood exactly how dangerous their plan could be. Before the mission, he warned the Avengers that if they messed with time, time was going to mess with them. And according to one of the most fascinating theories surrounding Avengers Doomsday, that's exactly what happened. Not immediately. Not in a way anyone could see. But somewhere inside the choices made during that time heist, a fracture was created. A fracture that would eventually spread far beyond one timeline, one universe, or even one generation of heroes. The strange thing is, the TVA already gave us the reason why the Avengers' time travel wasn't necessarily a problem. They weren't simply told that changing the past was harmless. The explanation was much more specific. The Avengers could travel through time because they eventually returned the Infinity Stones to the moments they had taken them from. In other words, the timeline could survive the mission because the stones were restored to their proper places. The branches created by the Avengers, actions could be corrected before they became something much bigger. That detail completely changes the way we look at Steve Rogers' final mission. Because Steve didn't just return the stones, he also took Mjolnir back to Asgard. And unlike the other Avengers, Steve didn't simply return to the present after completing the job. He stayed in the past. He chose a life that had been taken away from him, and for decades, he lived inside another version of history. To everyone watching Endgame, that moment was beautiful. Steve finally got his dance with Peggy. But what if that happy ending came with a cost that nobody understood? Think about the journey Steve would have had to make. He couldn't simply press a button and magically put everything back. He had to retrace the Avengers' entire time heist and restore the stolen pieces of history one by one. His first destination may have been Vormir, where the Soul Stone had been taken. Then he would have needed to return Mjolnir and the Ether to Asgard, restoring the weapons and stones to the exact moments where they belonged. And eventually he would have reached New York, where the remaining stones had been taken from the Battle of New York. That means Steve would have had to interact with some of the most important moments in MCU history, potentially crossing paths with people who were never supposed to know he existed. And one of those encounters becomes especially important, because after returning the stones, Steve had one final decision to make. He could return to his own timeline and live with the consequences of everything that had happened. Or he could go back to the life he had promised Peggy Carter decades earlier. Steve chose Peggy. And that choice created an entirely new reality. Now here's where the theory takes a much darker turn. Imagine Steve arriving in the past at the exact moment when his younger self is fighting Red Skull. Instead of simply watching history unfold, Steve intervenes. Red Skull is stopped. Hydra is destroyed much earlier. And this alternate timeline begins moving in a completely different direction. At first, that sounds like a good thing. Steve is doing what Steve Rogers always does. He's stopping evil before it has a chance to grow. He's creating peace. He's preventing tragedies that, in the original timeline, would eventually shape the entire world. But changing one event doesn't just erase one villain. It changes everything connected to that villain. Every invention, every conflict, every person who survives or dies because of that change now exists on a different path. And one of the biggest changes could involve something that seems almost insignificant compared to Steve's battle with Hydra the Tesseract. In this version of history, the Tesseract is lost deep beneath the ocean. And that single disappearance begins rewriting the future in ways Steve could never have predicted. Without the Tesseract, Howard Stark never gets the same opportunity to study its energy. The research that eventually contributes to the development of the arc reactor never happens in the same way. And without that technology, Tony Stark's future changes completely. The man who was supposed to become Iron Man never becomes Iron Man. The armor never exists. The Avengers never get the hero who eventually makes the ultimate sacrifice in Endgame. And there's an even bigger consequence hiding behind that one missing cube. Without the Tesseract, the chain of events that leads to Carol Danvers becoming Captain Marvel may never happen either. One stone has effectively disappeared from history, and with it, entire branches of the MCU's future begin collapsing into something unrecognizable. But Steve doesn't know any of this. From his perspective, he's finally earned the peaceful life he was denied. He has Peggy. Hydra has been defeated. The world is different, but it appears to be better. And somewhere along this new timeline, Howard and Maria Stark are still living their lives, unaware that their son is destined for a future that no longer exists. Until one moment changes everything. During a weapons deal in Latveria, Howard and Maria are attacked and killed. Tony survives, but the attack leaves him horribly burned and unrecognizable. The world doesn't know who he is. The identity of Tony Stark effectively disappears with the life he was supposed to have. And this is where another unexpected character enters the story. Agatha Harkness finds him. Instead of letting this damaged stranger die, she uses magic to heal him. But Agatha understands that Tony's survival could eventually put him back into danger. So she makes a decision that completely changes his destiny. Using ancient magic, she removes Tony Stark's identity from the minds of the world and gives him another name, Victor Von Doom. And suddenly, the greatest technological mind this alternate reality has ever produced is no longer Tony Stark. He is Victor Von Doom. He doesn't grow up as the billionaire genius we know. He grows up under the influence of Agatha, learning something his original counterpart never truly mastered: magic. But Tony's greatest gift was never simply his ability to build machines. It was his ability to understand impossible problems and find a way around them. Give that mind access to ancient magic, and the possibilities become terrifying. Victor begins combining technology with the mystical knowledge Agatha has taught him. He develops technology for the people of Latveria. He becomes admired by ordinary citizens because he isn't simply building weapons for himself, he's improving their lives. And that's exactly what makes him dangerous to the dictator ruling the country. Because dictators can tolerate fear, they can tolerate obedience. What they cannot tolerate is someone the people genuinely love. The dictator begins seeing Victor as a threat. Agatha becomes another target. She is publicly branded a witch and condemned to death. And when Victor tries to save her, everything goes horribly wrong. Agatha is killed, and Victor's face is burned again in the process. The event destroys whatever remained of the life he thought he was building. But it also creates the person we eventually recognize as Dr. Doom. Victor takes everything Agatha taught him, everything he learned through science and engineering, and everything he lost, and turns it into something new. He creates his armor by combining technology and magic. Then he kills the dictator and takes control of Latveria. To the outside world, it looks like the birth of another tyrant. But Victor doesn't see himself as a villain. He sees himself as the only person willing to do what is necessary to protect the people he loves. And that belief becomes even stronger when Victor begins reaching beyond his own world. He starts drawing power from other realms, pushing magic beyond the boundaries it was meant to occupy. But there is one person who understands exactly how dangerous this is. The Ancient One warns him that he is disturbing the balance of the universe. Magic has rules. Reality has rules. And Victor is beginning to cross boundaries that cannot be crossed without consequences. But Victor doesn't simply accept her warning. He challenges her with her own philosophy. If the Ancient One believes that every action creates consequences, then why should he stand aside while his people suffer? If she believes the universe has a natural balance, then what happens when that balance itself guarantees the destruction of everything he loves? This is the point where Victor's story stops being about power and starts becoming about survival. Because while Doom is trying to understand the forces surrounding his universe, another event is unfolding that will eventually destroy everything he has built. Peggy Carter dies. And Steve Rogers, the man whose decision created this alternate reality in the first place, finally leaves it behind. Steve returns to his original timeline. From his perspective, his journey is complete. He has lived the life he wanted, and now he can finally return to where he belongs. But the moment Steve leaves that alternate reality, something changes. The timeline that had been held together around his presence suddenly begins to destabilize. The universe had adapted to Steve's existence. His life had become part of its history, and removing him creates a fracture powerful enough to trigger an incursion. That is where the beautiful ending of Endgame becomes something much more disturbing. Steve thought he was simply going home, but from the perspective of the universe he left behind, he may have just pulled out one of the pieces holding reality together. The incursion doesn't care that Steve had good intentions. It doesn't care that he wanted a peaceful life. It doesn't care that he had saved the universe before. Reality only responds to the imbalance. And somewhere in Latveria, Victor Von Doom begins watching his world die. The first incursion is only the beginning, because Victor quickly discovers something terrifying. This is not a disaster that can be stopped by defeating one enemy. It is a structural failure in reality itself. Entire regions of existence begin colliding with other possibilities, and the closer Victor looks, the more impossible the problem becomes. Every time he tries to save his universe, another universe is damaged. Every solution creates another fracture. Every attempt to preserve the life he knows only pushes the multiverse closer to collapse. And this is where Victor does something that separates him from almost every hero we've seen before. He doesn't wait for someone else to fix it. He builds a machine that should not be possible, a time machine capable of taking him beyond the boundaries of his own timeline, allowing him to search through the infinite possibilities of existence and find the one reality where his people can actually survive. At first, Victor believes there has to be an answer somewhere. If one timeline is doomed, perhaps another isn't. If one version of Latveria falls, maybe another survives. If one version of himself can save his people, perhaps that version has already discovered the solution. So Victor begins searching. He moves through different possibilities, examining alternate outcomes and trying to understand what separates the realities that survive from the ones that collapse. But the more universes he observes, the more disturbing the pattern becomes. The incursions keep happening. Different choices lead to different worlds, different heroes, different histories, but eventually the same thing happens. Reality starts colliding with itself. Worlds begin dying. And Victor slowly realizes that the problem isn't confined to his universe. There isn't one broken timeline that needs to be repaired. The entire multiverse is infected. And then Victor discovers the detail that makes everything personal. His own universe wasn't supposed to exist in this form. The presence of Steve Rogers inside that alternate timeline had changed the balance of reality. Steve wasn't simply another person living in another universe. He was an anomaly created by a time travel decision from outside that world's natural history. He entered the past, built a life there, changed events around him, and then eventually left. For decades, the universe had adapted around that contradiction. But once Steve returned to his original timeline, the balance collapsed. And suddenly Victor realizes that the catastrophe destroying his world can be traced back to one decision made by someone who never even knew Victor existed. That discovery creates an impossible dilemma. Victor could theoretically go back and stop Steve from creating that alternate timeline in the first place. He could prevent the chain of events that eventually leads to the incursion. He could erase the problem before it ever becomes a problem. But there is one catch. If Steve never creates that alternate timeline, Victor never becomes Dr. Doom. Tony Stark's original life continues. Agatha never raises Victor. Latveria never gets its protector. The man who discovered the multiverse's collapse would never exist. Victor understands that stopping Steve would mean stopping himself. He would have to choose between saving reality and preserving his own existence. And for someone like Doom, that isn't really a choice at all. Because Victor has spent his entire life refusing to accept a reality he believes is unfair. He survived the attack that killed his parents. He survived the destruction of his identity. He lost Agatha. He watched his country suffer under a dictator. He rebuilt himself through science and magic. Every time the universe told him that something could not be changed, he found another way. So when the multiverse itself tells him that destruction is inevitable, Victor doesn't accept it. Instead, he goes even further. He uses dreamwalking to look beyond the limitations of his own reality, moving through the consciousness and possibilities of other universes. And what he sees is far worse than he expected. The multiverse isn't simply breaking in isolated places. It's behaving like a living system with a disease spreading through it. One universe collapses into another. A surviving reality becomes unstable because of a neighboring reality's destruction. Heroes who might have saved their own worlds instead become victims of collisions they never caused. Entire civilizations disappear without even understanding why. And every new universe Victor studies seems to confirm the same conclusion. There is no permanent solution that allows every reality to survive independently. The multiverse has become too unstable. Too many branches exist. Too many contradictions have accumulated. Too many timelines are fighting for the same space. And eventually, all of them will collide. For Victor, this should be the moment where he gives up. Instead, it becomes the moment where he finally understands what he has to do. He can't save every universe. He can't stop every incursion. He can't preserve the multiverse in the form it currently exists. But perhaps he doesn't have to. Maybe the answer isn't preventing the end. Maybe the answer is controlling it. If the destruction of reality is inevitable, then the only variable Victor can still control is when and how it happens. And if he can manipulate the timing of the collapse, he may be able to create something new before everything disappears. That idea changes everything. Victor stops looking for a way to repair the multiverse and starts designing a way to survive its death. He begins thinking beyond individual timelines and individual universes. He imagines a world created from the remains of everything that came before it. A single reality assembled after the collapse, built from pieces of destroyed universes and populated by the survivors of worlds that no longer exist. It would not be the universe they lost. It would be something entirely new. A world where the rules could be rewritten from the beginning. A place where Victor could finally guarantee that his people would never again be at the mercy of forces they couldn't control. But there is something else hidden inside that vision. Victor doesn't just want to create this new reality. He wants to control it. After spending his entire life watching people with power make decisions that destroy the lives of everyone else, he becomes convinced that freedom itself is part of the problem. Too many heroes, too many timelines, too many versions of history, too many people making choices that create consequences for worlds they will never even know exist. Victor believes the multiverse failed because nobody was willing to take absolute responsibility for it. So when the old reality dies, he intends to become the one person who decides what comes next. And suddenly, Dr. Doom's greatest ambition isn't conquest in the traditional sense. He's not simply trying to take over one country or defeat one superhero team. He's trying to become the architect of existence itself. The new world he imagines would be built from the ruins of countless dead universes, with the survivors living together under one reality. But that reality would have a ruler. One person would decide its laws, its borders, its history, and its future. And that person would be Victor Von Doom. This is where the connection to Tony Stark becomes almost tragic. In the original timeline, Tony Stark spent years believing that he could solve every problem himself. He built machines because machines gave him control. He created Ultron because he wanted armor around the world. And eventually, when the universe needed someone to make the ultimate sacrifice, Tony was willing to give his life to save everyone else. But in this alternate reality, Tony never becomes Iron Man. He never becomes an Avenger. He never learns that sometimes saving people means letting go. Instead, he becomes Victor Von Doom, a man who reaches the opposite conclusion. Victor believes that if he wants to save everyone, he has to control everything. And that's what makes this version of Doom so dangerous. He isn't evil simply because he enjoys destruction. He doesn't want the multiverse to burn. He wants to save it. He has seen too much suffering to believe that another imperfect solution will be enough. He has watched worlds disappear. He has watched people he loves die. He has spent years searching through realities and discovering that every path eventually leads toward the same catastrophe. So from Victor's perspective, the choice becomes painfully simple. If billions of people have to lose their old lives so that existence itself can survive, then he is willing to make that sacrifice. And if someone has to decide which parts of reality deserve to survive, Victor believes he is the only person capable of making that decision. But there's a final irony buried inside all of this. The man who believes he can save the multiverse may be the reason the multiverse is worth saving in the first place. Because without Steve Rogers' decision, there is no Victor Von Doom. Without Victor Von Doom, there is no one searching for a way to survive the incursions. Without the alternate timeline, Tony Stark becomes the man we already know. And without that alternate timeline collapsing, the multiverse may never produce the exact chain of events that leads to Doom's rise. So Steve and Doom become connected in a way neither of them could ever understand. Steve creates the timeline that creates Doom. Doom discovers the consequences of Steve's choice. Steve's departure triggers the disaster that forces Doom to search the multiverse. And Doom's search eventually leads him to the conclusion that the multiverse cannot be saved in its current form. One hero's desire for a peaceful life creates another man's obsession with controlling reality. And this completely changes the meaning of Steve's final scene in Endgame. For years, we looked at Steve sitting beside Peggy as the perfect ending to his story. After everything he sacrificed, he finally got the life he wanted. But if this theory is true, that peaceful ending wasn't the end of the story at all. It was the first domino. The dance with Peggy wasn't just Steve finally keeping his promise. It was the moment a new universe was born, the moment Tony Stark's destiny was rewritten, and the moment the road toward Dr. Doom quietly began. And the most unsettling part is that Steve didn't do anything malicious. He wasn't trying to break reality. He wasn't trying to create another universe. He simply wanted to go home to the person he loved. That's what makes the theory work on a much deeper level. The multiverse doesn't need villains to collapse. Sometimes all it takes is a good person making the one choice that feels completely right to them. And somewhere inside that choice, Tony Stark's story was rewritten forever. The man who once saved the universe by snapping his fingers never became Iron Man in this reality. Instead, he became the man who watched the multiverse die and decided that he would be the one to rebuild it. But rebuilding the multiverse comes with a price, because Victor now has to face the one thing he has spent his entire life trying to avoid. The possibility that saving everyone may require destroying the world they know. And the more he studies the collapsing realities, the more convinced he becomes that there is no clean solution waiting at the end of the road. There is no secret Infinity Stone, no single enemy he can defeat, and no heroic sacrifice that magically restores everything. The old multiverse has reached a point where its own history has become the weapon destroying it. Every universe carries the consequences of choices made in another universe. Every timeline is connected to possibilities that should never have existed. And every attempt to correct one mistake creates another. Victor finally understands that the multiverse doesn't need a hero who can fix the past. It needs someone willing to decide what survives the future. That realization is what transforms Doom from a survivor into a ruler. Until this point, Victor's actions have been driven by fear. Fear of losing Latveria, fear of losing the people he loves, fear of becoming powerless again. But now that fear becomes something much larger. He isn't trying to protect one country anymore. He believes he's protecting existence itself. And that belief gives him permission to cross every line he once thought was impossible. He can manipulate time. He can use magic to reach into other realities. He can study versions of himself, versions of heroes, versions of entire civilizations. He can watch universes fall without being able to save them. Eventually, Victor stops asking whether what he's doing is morally right. He starts asking whether it will work. And once those become the only questions that matter, Dr. Doom becomes almost impossible to stop. This is also where the old Tony Stark begins to disappear completely. Because Tony's greatest strength in the original universe was his humanity. For all his arrogance, sarcasm, mistakes, and obsession with control, there was always a part of Tony that understood the value of other people. He learned to trust Steve. He learned to fight beside Thor and Bruce. He built a family with Pepper. He became a father. And when the final moment came, he understood that saving the universe meant giving up everything he had built. Victor never gets that version of Tony's life. He doesn't have the Avengers to teach him humility. He doesn't have Pepper to pull him back. He doesn't have Steve as a friend. He doesn't have a team that can challenge his decisions before they become disasters. Instead, his greatest influence is Agatha. His greatest teacher is loss, and his greatest lesson is that power is the only thing that can protect what matters. That's why the Doom armor becomes more than a costume in this story. It represents the point where Victor stops trying to recover the man he could have been. His face has already been destroyed twice. His identity as Tony Stark has been erased. His connection to his original life is gone. The armor becomes the physical expression of the person he has created from all of that trauma. Technology represents the mind of Tony Stark. Magic represents everything Agatha taught him. The mask represents Victor hiding the identity that the world no longer remembers. And inside that armor is someone who has effectively become both men at once. He has Tony's intelligence without Tony's emotional anchors, and he has Doom's ambition without the limitations of a normal human life. That combination is what makes this version so dangerous. And there's another detail that makes Victor's journey even more tragic. He doesn't discover the truth about Steve because he hates him. In fact, Steve Rogers may represent almost everything Victor wishes he could have had. Steve was given the opportunity to go back and live the life he wanted. Victor never received that choice. Steve could return to Peggy. Victor lost Agatha. Steve could walk away from history. Victor became trapped inside its consequences. Steve created a world by following his heart. Victor is now trying to save that world by abandoning his own. And the irony becomes almost unbearable when Victor realizes that the person whose decision destroyed his universe is also the person he would have to erase to prevent it. But Victor cannot simply travel back and kill Steve. The multiverse has already changed. The timeline has already produced him. If he removes the event that created his existence, then he disappears with it. And perhaps this is the first time Doom encounters a problem that technology and magic cannot solve. He can't save himself and erase himself at the same time. So instead of correcting the original mistake, he starts searching for another answer. If Steve's decision cannot be undone without destroying Victor, then perhaps Steve's decision can be used as the foundation for something new. That is where the idea of a final reality begins to take shape. Victor starts imagining a world created after the incursions, a reality assembled from the surviving fragments of countless universes. The people who survive wouldn't necessarily understand what happened. They might remember different histories. They might come from completely different worlds. Heroes who were once enemies could suddenly exist in the same reality. Dead characters from one universe could exist alongside survivors from another. Entire civilizations could be placed together, despite having completely different origins. And Victor would know the truth. He would know that this world is artificial. He would know that it exists because he controlled the collapse. That knowledge gives him something no ruler has ever possessed. He would not simply rule the new world. He would understand its architecture. He would know which pieces came from which universes. He would know why certain people survived. He would know which memories were real and which were rewritten. And because he created the rules, he could convince everyone that the world they live in is natural. To the survivors, Doom might not even look like a dictator at first. He could look like the man who saved them when there was nowhere else to go. And that's where the line between savior and villain completely disappears. Imagine surviving the destruction of your universe and waking up in a world where your family is alive, your home exists, and the people you lost have somehow returned. Would you question the man who gave all of that back to you? Would you really care that the world was built from the remains of countless destroyed realities? If Doom can give people a life they thought they had lost forever, then he doesn't need to force them to follow him. Many of them might willingly do it. This is what makes the idea of Doom ruling a new reality so much more terrifying than a simple conquest. He doesn't have to tell everyone that he is a tyrant. He can tell them that he saved them. And technically he would be right. Without him, they would be dead. Without him, their universes would be gone forever. Without him, there would be no place for them to wake up. Victor can use that truth to justify everything else. Every law, every sacrifice. Every person he decides cannot be trusted. Every hero he decides is too dangerous. Every memory he decides should be changed. In his mind, absolute control becomes the price of survival. And now the Avengers face a completely different kind of enemy. They aren't fighting someone who simply wants to destroy their world. They're fighting someone who believes their world has already been destroyed and that he has built something better in its place. That's a much harder enemy to defeat, because defeating Doom could mean destroying the only reality where billions of people are still alive. The heroes would have to ask themselves a question that has no easy answer. If the world is artificial but the people living in it are real, does destroying the world actually save anyone? And this is where the emotional conflict becomes far bigger than Tony Stark versus the Avengers. The real conflict is between two philosophies of saving the universe. One side believes that people must have the freedom to choose their own future, even if those choices create mistakes, suffering, and uncertainty. The other believes that freedom is exactly what caused the disaster, and that someone powerful enough must take control before everyone loses everything. Steve Rogers represents the first idea. Doom represents the second. And ironically, Steve's decision is what helped create the man who believes so strongly in the opposite philosophy. The tragedy is that Steve may never even understand his role in it. He doesn't know that by staying with Peggy, he created a timeline where Tony Stark became Victor Von Doom. He doesn't know that his eventual departure triggered an incursion. He doesn't know that Victor spent years searching through the multiverse and eventually discovered the connection. And he certainly doesn't know that the man now preparing to reshape reality was once the child who could have grown into the same Tony Stark Steve fought beside. That means when Doom eventually stands against the Avengers, he may not see them as strangers. He may see them as ghosts from a life that should have belonged to him. He could look at Iron Man's legacy and understand exactly what he lost. He could look at Steve Rogers and see the man responsible for the timeline that created him. He could look at the Avengers and realize that these people had the life he was supposed to have. And that creates a conflict that no simple villain motivation can explain. Because somewhere beneath the armor, Victor is still the man who lost everything. And perhaps that is why the ultimate irony of this theory is not that Tony Stark became Dr. Doom. It's that Tony Stark became Dr. Doom because he never got the chance to become Tony Stark. In the original universe, Tony had to learn that he couldn't control everything. He had to learn that protecting people didn't mean deciding their future for them. He had to learn that sacrifice could be an act of love rather than an act of control. Victor never gets those lessons. His life teaches him the opposite. Every time he trusts the universe, someone dies. Every time he accepts reality, reality takes something from him. Every time he tries to save someone, he discovers another consequence. So eventually he decides that the only way to prevent loss is to remove uncertainty itself. And that is the moment Dr. Doom becomes the greatest threat the Avengers have ever faced. Not because he wants to destroy the universe. Because he wants to save it so badly that he's willing to become its god. When we look back at Endgame from that perspective, the entire story begins to feel different. The Avengers thought they were traveling backward to repair a single tragedy. Steve thought he was returning the stones, and then finally choosing the life he had always wanted. Tony thought he was helping the universe survive. None of them could see the chain reaction that their decisions might create. One timeline becomes another. One choice changes another life. One universe begins to fracture. And eventually, the consequences spread beyond anything the original Avengers could possibly imagine. The most haunting part is that the story doesn't begin with Doom. It begins with a victory. The Avengers defeat Thanos. They bring everyone back. Steve returns the stones. Tony makes the ultimate sacrifice. And then Steve chooses Peggy. That choice feels like peace. But in this theory, peace is only the beginning. Because somewhere in that alternate timeline, a young man named Tony Stark loses his parents. His identity disappears. Agatha Harkness becomes his teacher. Latveria becomes his home. Magic and technology become his weapons. His face becomes a mask. His grief becomes ambition. And eventually, that young man looks across an infinite number of dying realities and realizes something no one else is willing to accept. The multiverse is going to die. And if he can't save the multiverse as it was, then he'll create something that can replace it. A new reality. A new world. A world built from the ashes of everything that came before. And at the center of that world will stand the man who believes he alone has earned the right to rule it. Victor Von Doom. The man who might have once been Tony Stark. And suddenly, Avengers Doomsday doesn't just become a story about heroes fighting Dr. Doom. It becomes the story of the Avengers confronting the consequences of their own history. The consequences of time travel. The consequences of choices that seemed harmless. The consequences of trying to fix one broken universe without understanding how deeply connected every universe really is. Because maybe the greatest threat wasn't created when Thanos snapped his fingers. Maybe it was created when the Avengers decided they could go back and change time. And maybe Tony Stark's greatest warning was never about what would happen if they changed the past. It was about what the future would do because of it. If this theory is anywhere close to what Marvel has planned, then the most devastating twist of Avengers Doomsday may not be discovering that Dr. Doom is powerful enough to challenge the Avengers. It may be discovering that, in another universe, Dr. Doom was one of them all along. And that the road from Steve Rogers choosing Peggy to Tony Stark becoming Doom was never a series of random events. It was one continuous chain. One choice created a timeline. That timeline created Victor. Victor discovered the incursions. The incursions forced him to search the multiverse. And the multiverse convinced him that the only way to save everyone was to control the end. So when Doom finally stands before the heroes of the MCU, he may not believe he's destroying their future. He may believe he's correcting their past. And that makes the question at the heart of this entire theory far more disturbing than simply asking whether Dr. Doom can defeat the Avengers. The real question is whether the Avengers can defeat a man who believes everything he is doing is the only way to save them. Because if Victor is right about one thing, the multiverse really may be dying. But if he's wrong about the solution, then the man who wanted to save every universe could become the person who decides which universe deserves to exist. And that is where the tragedy of Tony Stark reaches its darkest possible ending. He once looked at the universe and said, "I am Iron Man." In this reality, the same mind, shaped by a completely different life, may one day look at the ruins of the multiverse and declare something far more terrifying. I am Doom. If you enjoyed this theory, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to FILMCAST for more Marvel breakdowns and cinematic theories. And if you want to support the channel even more, you can also send a $25 super thanks. It genuinely helps keep FILMCAST going.